Hello, beloved. I am Pastor Victor Resendiz. Welcome to this four-part weekly series we are calling Still Here, the gift of God's presence. How does God remain constantly present with or among us today, even as things shift around us? Each week, we will be discussing how our spiritual practices can make us aware of God in our daily lives. I will be joined by Jerry Weber, pastor, contemplative teacher, and founder of the Center of Christian Spirituality. Our desire is for these conversations to invite you to explore deeper into the message from the Still Here sermon series and to reflect where is the Holy Spirit inviting you to be attentive to God's presence. Well, hello everyone to our first conversation of the Still Here sermon series that we're starting today. I am here with, or honored to be here with a friend of mine, a brother of mine, a teacher of mine, Jerry Weber. And as you heard in the introduction, many roles that he plays. So Jerry, thank you so much for joining me and joining us for this four-part series of conversations on Still Here and God's presence. So thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, thanks, Victor. Thanks for inviting me. This is great. I always love being with you.
Appreciate that. So the reason why we started these conversations back in June, I guess that's when we started. Our desire is to guide people and to invite people to go deeper into, in this case, a sermon series, or when you're doing your Bible studies. We want to encourage you to go deeper into a deeper end of the material that you are learning. And so I had a brief description of what I think is our intention here, and you can add something if you like, Jerry, or vouch for me. But a sermon or a Bible study should be or is part of our spiritual formation, and not just more information that we learn about God. I mean, would you vouch for something like that? What do you think about that, Jerry?
Yeah, I think that's really true. That a sermon or a Bible study teaching is not just imparting information, though information is part of it. But always, I think the end goal is practice. What is our practice? How does this work itself into my practice? And I think, it's possible to sit and hear a lot of sermons and be a part of a lot of Bible studies, and those things never touch, where the wheel hits the road, sort of thing.
That's correct. That's correct.
So yeah, how do we get this into my life? How do I think about this, not just with my mind, but with my heart?
That's right. That's right. And Jerry, I've been a student of yours for almost 11 years now. And so Jerry wrote this book, Spiritual Foundations, which is it's just a compilation of many years of reflection and journaling and thoughts and lessons and things like that. So it's a phenomenal workbook, and I use it quite a bit. But I love the definition that you wrote of spiritual formation in this book. This is what Jerry wrote. Spiritual formation refers to an intentional pilgrimage in which one opens up to the shaping work of God's Spirit in order to be the person God created him or her to be. The journey is rooted in a lifelong process of growth into wholeness in Jesus Christ, a journey inward towards the center, and a growing life of self-giving attentiveness, a journey outward toward others and the world. And that's something that I have applied since I've learned that from you, Jerry, that three movements of God, self, others, because what I learned from that, it took away from my individualistic way of seeing the gospel, that it was just about me being a good Christian, that this is further, it goes further than that. So what God is doing in my life is transformational, but then it has to have an outlet of how it is displayed out to the world and to others by loving on them, having compassion, and genuinely leading an authentic life. And I can't, and when I see you, I always appreciate that about you, because even when we've done the past prayer conferences here at MDUMC, I mentioned that to the crowd because I think that's so valuable for people to be aware that our pilgrimage, as you call it, has this movement constantly. So I love that concept of, that you've shared with us over the years.
Yeah, I came to that out of my own sense, out of my own kind of living into that in a real self-referenced way. Not only my salvation for a lot of years, but then like 27 years ago when I started getting interested in spiritual formation and exploring that, there was a good long block of time at the beginning of my own spiritual explorations when I thought it was just about Jerry and Jesus, you know, and kind of lining up with Jesus, and that all the rest of the world didn't matter. So,
Sure.
you know, there was this sense of personal holiness and righteousness, and you know, it took me maybe a decade or so to kind of begin to look outward and say, wait, how does this impact other people, and how does it impact the world?
That's
Uh,
correct. Yeah.
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 So I
Yeah.
didn't come to that. It took me a lot of years to kind of come to that outward movement.
Yeah. And it's so aligned to the Great Commission
Oh
that
yeah.
we're being sent out rather than he never, that it wasn't an indication, stay here and keep learning. It was more like go out, and
Yes.
that's the indication. Yeah, I really, like I said, that's been such an impacting reminder for my own walk, and even in a role as a pastor, that I don't take that away. I am still an individual learning my own, my own growth, my own deepening my own faith. So today's scripture, it comes from Hebrew chapter 1, 1 through verse 1 through verse 3. And it says, long ago, God spoke to our ancestors in many and various ways by the prophets. But in these last days, he has spoken to us by a son, whom he appointed heir of all things, through whom he also created the worlds. He is the reflection of God's glory and the exact imprint of God's very being. And he sustains all things by his powerful word. When he had made purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the majesty on high. So, Jerry, my first question to you, based on this Hebrew scripture, how do you bring or experience the cosmic into our everyday life? Because this is a very cosmic, big picture scripture.
Right.
How do I do that in my own little life of
Right.
every day?
Yeah, the book of Hebrews is kind of full of that kind of big, grandiose language, right? So, so I guess my first thought about that is that we are a part of the cosmic. So the first thing that we might think about the cosmic is that it's all way out there, it's somewhere else, or the universal, it's somebody else. But I'm a part of that, and where I live and the work that I do, and where you live and the work that you do, you're a part of that, and I'm a part of that. We're all a part of that. So the cosmic is not something out there, it's where we are. The other thing I'll say about that is I'm not sure that we bring that we bring the cosmic into everyday life as much as the cosmic is already part of everyday life. And so, for instance, Christ himself, the very presence of Christ is in everything. Somebody said that the world is shot through with the presence of Christ. And a lot of our poets and theologians have said the same thing. Gerard Manley Hopkins begins his most famous poem by saying the world is charged with the grandeur of God. And so the whole cosmos, the universe is just shot through. It's charged with the presence. And so to the extent that we are in the cosmos, we are part of the cosmic, it's already all around us. And so to experience that, what we have to really bring to experience it is our own awareness, our own perception. Mm-hmm. So I think we're going to talk about that in some different ways all through this Still Here series, but that seems to be, the kind of the additive that we have to bring to the equation.
Sure. Yeah.
Because God isn't going to overpower us with that. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And so there are a lot of us, I think, who are kind of looking for the message written in the sky. Mm-hmm. Like, oh, if I see that, then I'll know it's God. Or if this great miracle happens, or if things just turn out a certain way, then that's going to be a sign that God's here. No, God's already here.
Yeah.
We already live in the midst of this cosmic presence of God. So how do we become more perceptive? How do we become more aware of what's already present?
Sure. I think we have a tendency, just our human nature. First of all, what I find or I found in just walking the faith, sometimes we, as humans, we romanticize too much. So we love the poetic, notion of, oh, this universe, God, God
Yeah.
universe is so romanticized. And then the other part of us is this very puny way of thinking about it in a deeper level. And so we kind of dismiss it because then we got to go on about our business and we got to go on about our day. So we don't capture the cosmos in our own lives because of those reasons, which brings me to our topic today, that finding God everywhere, the life-giving spaces. This is something else that I've been carrying from your lessons for many years. I remember you teaching about the life-giving spaces is where you can find this cosmic grandeur of God in your life. And so I want you to talk a bit about that, the life-giving spaces. How do we live deeply or inspired into those life-giving spaces? And so I guess the question, first of all, is what would be a life-giving space in your definition? And then how do we lean deeply into those spaces?
Yeah, I think of a life-giving space as just anywhere where any place where my awareness is attuned to that presence of God. So really, any place can be a life-giving space. When I tended to ask I've asked the question through the years of people or a group, where are the places that you're most in tune with God, or you're most, you most sense God's presence? People say, oh, it's a beach, or it's the mountains, or it's this lake, or, it's always some experience out there in nature. And then if you follow that up and say, well, how often are you in that space? They say, well, maybe I get to go 1 week a year or something, so that like leaves 51 weeks of the year when I'm really not in tune with what I consider a life-giving space.
Right.
And so I'm drudging through life for 51 weeks, just waiting for that week in July when I get to go to Colorado or whatever.
That's right. Yeah.
So for me, it's about how do I turn this ordinary kind of everyday living into a place where I sense life and where I know life.
Yes.
I think we've got a couple of things working against us there. One of them is that we have an assumption that life should be easy. And as we're learning during the pandemic and during this period of racial questioning, these are hard things that we have to deal with. And so some people have kind of checked out because it's no longer easy.
Sure.
And I think the other thing that we assume is that life should be exciting.
Mm-hmm.
And so we associate anything that has to do with routine with boredom.
Sure.
I mean, we're all like a bunch of 4-year-olds who are whining, I'm bored, I'm bored.
Yes. Yes.
And so the pandemic has brought that out, I don't think the pandemic has brought our sense of boredom to us, but it's kind of uncovered the basic boredom we already feel.
Yes.
Because it's taken away all the ways that we usually distract ourselves.
Yes, absolutely.
We couldn't go to movies, we couldn't go out to eat, so we couldn't do the usual things that we use to kind of cover over our boredom.
Sure.
And so all of a sudden we're doing the same routine. So I, that's a long way around answering your question to say somehow we've got to be okay with kind of a routine or the everyday, the mundane. Paula D'Arcy, who famously said, God comes to us disguised as our life.
Lives, yes, yes.
Not our exciting life or our thrilling life when we go to the mountains or the beach or whatever, but just the everyday stuff that we do. Correct. Somehow God is in that.
It brings me to this conversation I recently had in seminary. We were talking about the pandemic, and the professor prompted the question, how have you dealt with it, or how have you managed it? And so a lot of the language was exactly that: angst and anxiety or boredom, this, that, the other. And one of the things that I mentioned, that having the spiritual practices such as this awareness of life-giving spaces, for me, the pandemic did not affect me as that way. because I was already, it's almost like you train yourself to be in solitude. You train yourself to be in stillness. You train yourself to be okay with being in the moment and not the next thing, rushing to the next thing. And as I was sharing that with people, I couldn't get over how much it really deepens the inspiration of life. There's a term in Spanish that we call la belleza de la vida, the beauty of life. You do stop that, even if it is like my favorite song, I'm in that moment, as mundane as that may sound, or even cleaning a house with music on, as mundane as that may sound, that's a life-giving space. One of the things that I learned from you over the years, and we did this in a staff retreat one time, and you taught us this concept, right, of the life-giving spaces. And I remember you said, I'll give you an example. And the reason I'm mentioning this, because for me, it brought me from, like you said, this perspective of waiting for this incredible thing to happen to me, for me to say, oh, I saw God, to going, you said, I'll give you an example. For me, life-giving is to go to my garden, to walk my dog. And I just remember sitting there going, all right. And then you said, but it's going to look different for all of you. So you have to look for those life spaces. What do they look like? And I remember one of the assignments you got us to do is, list them. They're there. You said, they're there. And I remember sitting down with an intention to write those down. Oh my goodness. I mean, you talk about from the soccer field, my conversations with my daughter. At that time I was doing my undergrad. So even being in school, I mean, those were these little spaces that where I never really took the time to acknowledge, also became these cosmic, huge things where I was like, oh my goodness, all along God has been here. And I've been looking for him all, I need fireworks, So for me, that was very impacting to practice that awareness that these things are here daily. And so it's tied into what you're saying.
So one of the other ways to say that, if people don't resonate with the language of life-giving spaces, another way to say that is, what are the things that feed your soul? Where you're doing that thing and you just feel the sense that, oh, this is really feeding me. This is really enlarging who I am. It's helping me to live more deeply.
Yes. Speaking of that, a few months back, well, this is before the pandemic, so I guess almost a year now. I was teaching. I do the contemplative teachings here on Monday nights, and I have a group. And I remember we were having a conversation about life-giving spaces. And so you'd be surprised how many people don't realize, that they've left their life-giving spaces for a long time. And one of them was this one person used to play the piano. And I said, well, why did you stop? And she said, well, I don't know. And she goes, just life got in the way. And I go, but why not? I said, do you still have your piano? She says, yes, it's still sitting in the living room. So I was like, well, go start with chopsticks. I go, I don't know, just get that feeling again. And then later on, maybe a few months later, she started taking lessons again here at the church. She said, I went back. She goes, and I have forgotten how much I enjoy that. And it's just therapeutic for me. And for me, you know how that is, teaching these type of practices. When somebody gets it, and you said this to me, is this, that's it. Now run with that. And it was so wonderful to hear that, because to me it's like, yes, find that and move to that, because there's more,
Yeah. So, I mean, what does it look like to find those places where we spend most of our time?
That's right.
Why wouldn't I want to be intentional about if I spend a lot of time in an office, for instance, why wouldn't I want to find some way that the office setting could be life-giving or could feed my soul? What could I look for there that's already there?
Correct.
Or, in my kitchen, or in a trip to the grocery store, whatever it is.
That's
what can I look for in those settings where I already spend time, so I'm not waiting for that one moment a year when I'm going to be inspired?
Correct. Exactly. And what we're talking about here is, that's when you start finding out to lead an authentic life every single day. That's exactly right. Yes. So another thing that I loved about your spiritual formation workbook, you have this description of a deep connection with God. And this is what you wrote. And I know you remember word for word.
Oh yeah, always.
Spirituality refers to a person's deepening connection with God that makes a difference in their relationship with God, self, others, and the created world. And we talked a little bit about that. But another thing that I got out of this was, you mentioned this, and I'm going to connect the question that I have for you. How do we surrender, and this is what you wrote, the restless longing that stirs within every human heart? So how do we surrender to the restless longing that stirs within every human heart?
Yeah, if I wrote that, I would probably write it a little bit differently now, because I think we all do surrender to that restless longing, but we surrender to it in ways that are kind of sideways. Mm. And one of the ways that I've taken to describing the spiritual life or discipleship in recent years is that it's like the spiritual life or the life of discipleship is our orbit around God. Mm. But the reality is that we all orbit around other things first. And so that restlessness that's at the heart of us, we try to satisfy that. I mean, you know as well as I do that, and we continue to do this. We try all different things. You know, that's the basis of addiction. We put our work in the center. We put even good things. We put our family in the center. We put this person in the center, even this person that I love and that I feel God has given to me.
Sure.
So, you know, we try to fill that restlessness in a lot of different ways. And so how do we surrender? How do we come back to kind of this first sense of, wait, God is the center. I want to orbit around God, and then everything else falls in its place. The restlessness can just lead us in all different kinds of directions.
Sure.
So that deepening to me is, you know, a lot of that happens kind of in hindsight, by trial and error. So I experiment with this thing, or I try this thing and find, well, that didn't really help me to deepen my connection with God or to fill this restless longing. And so without guilt or shame about that, I try something else.
Sure.
And sometimes I only know in hindsight. So the spiritual practice, and I know you teach people this spiritual practice also, is that prayer of examine, the examine of consciousness, or the, you know, prayer of awareness, same word for it, the kind of thing we read about in Sleeping with Bread by the Lens.
Yes.
So you practice in hindsight, kind of in retrospect, oh, that was, you know, oh, that satisfied me, or that God was in that, you know, and I didn't recognize it at the time. And you learn over time when you do the practice in hindsight, there comes a point when all of a sudden in the moment when you're doing something, it clicks and says, you say, oh, this is that restlessness. And I'm not satisfying it by taking a drink or by shopping or by binge eating or watching Netflix.
Sure.
This restlessness right now, God satisfied that.
That's right.
And so, you know, we're kind of, but I think in some ways we just have to practice that. There's not an easy secret kind of Gnostic key that's going to unlock the door for you.
Sure. I love that, because you know, the one thing I can think about, or the movement that I can think about, is to lean in towards that restlessness.
Yeah.
And resist it, or rather than, in this case, supplement it with something else that's just going to be temporary.
Right.
And we're not saying that Netflix is wrong, or having a drink is wrong. But what we're saying is that deeper restlessness that we just described, that's fulfilled by God. And so I remember this too, and I love quoting you back, because I like seeing your face like, oh, I said that. But one time in one of your lectures, you talked about this bottomless well, and that so this restlessness is you, when you're leaning towards that, instead of supplementing it with something, or substituting with something that's not as fulfilling, or it's not going to quench that longing, the gesture of leaning in is what I see is grabbing my bucket and going to this bottomless well, and then kind of digging out what's going to come out of this water well, right?
Right.
And then, sort of submerge yourself in it because something will happen. And it's trusting that gesture. What's the key to it, and I can talk about my story all the time because, and you've seen my trajectory from the beginning, but when I see it in other people that make that decision to just lean in, and I see this glow in their face just kind of turn on, and then they start telling me their stories of what they've been missing out or the things that now they're noticing. And so leaning into this restlessness, what it does, it just continues to what I call, and this is how I describe it to some people. It's like my physical hunger tells me that 11:30 or noon, I'm hungry for food.
Right.
And so my spirit, when I start leaning towards this restlessness, it starts to prompt me that I'm hungry for God.
Yeah.
Right. And not in a cheesy way, not in a romanticized way, no, in an authentic, real way.
Right.
That something is pulling me, alluring me towards, spending this time in the presence. And it looks like all these life spaces. And then sometimes it does look grandeur.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like the birth of my daughter was definitely something that was huge.
Right.
So, but that's how I kind of have learned that from your teachings. And kind of, I remember when you described that bottomless water well, for me, that gesture of leaning in was grabbing my bucket. Do you approve of that metaphor?
Yeah, I love that. I love the whole image of leaning into something. And, I think we can learn a whole lot about ourselves spiritually by noticing what we resist.
Mm-hmm.
And resistance is kind of the opposite of leaning in.
Mm-hmm.
So if we'll lean into that restlessness, but when we resist that kind of inner restlessness for God, and we start to go other places and fill that with other things.
Sure.
And, why am I resisting that? Why am I, so to even ask why I'm resisting the restlessness is helpful. But I love the leaning in, the kind of, and being okay that I'm incomplete there.
Mm-hmm. Correct.
That's the other part of kind of American culture, that if we're not perfect or if we don't get this right, then we're flawed.
That's right.
People, and so we don't ever want to admit to ourselves that we're incomplete. And the fact is, we're always going to be incomplete, and we're just kind of incrementally making progress.
That's right. Well, as you say, as you always tell us, this is lifelong work.
Yeah, no doubt.
So that's the beauty of it, that we get to explore that every day. And I'm going to, I mentioned this in the introduction, but one of my favorite titles that you've given yourself is Explorer.
Yeah.
Because you're so right. We have an opportunity, and we have the invitation to explore God's grace every single day. Yeah. I mean, it's just amazing to be able to have that open canvas for us to go and paint and for us to go and explore. And I love the trial and error, because there's no guilt behind it, because all along God is with me.
Yeah.
So I'm not doing this on my own, and this is not some kind of individual philosophy or anything like that.
There are a whole lot of people who don't like trial and error because they feel like if they explore too far, they're going to fall over the edge.
Yes.
It's like, the flat earth world, and there's an end to the world. And if, the old maps that said around the edge, here lie the dragons. So
yes,
like if you travel off the map of what you've already drawn of your life, you're going to go in a place that you can't return.
That's correct.
And I think that's just bad spirituality, bad theology.
Yes.
I think God keeps us tethered to God's heart, and then says, go explore. Rilke has a poem about that when God created us, he sent us out and said, go to the limits of your longing.
That's right.
And that's literally in his poem. And it's like, that's God's message to us as human beings when God creates us. Go to the limits of your longing.
Sure.
And another part of his poem says, you can't lose me. Yeah. So, how great is that we can trial and error, we can explore, we can, experiment with this or with that, and we're not going to lose God.
Sure. Absolutely. What's so neat about this type of exploration, Jerry, that I've learned, and I know you live this too. The difference is that before I leaned in towards this type of spiritual practice, I knew a lot of Bible, I knew a lot of scripture, I knew a lot of doctrine, theology, you know, whatever. So it seemed like even when I was leading a group or teaching or being a student, I still separated myself from that, right? But my life was something else. So it was like two stories. Leaning into these spiritual practices, what is done in my life, and I know this for a fact because I've witnessed yours too, you embody this, like this is who you are. So us teaching it, first of all, that's the reason why you see passion come out of us, and mostly enthusiasm, because when we're saying these things, I know we're feeling them because we've been there in that experience in God's presence. Would you agree to that? I mean, isn't that what you live?
No doubt. Yeah, I just saw, and I've been in this place and maybe still live in this place some, but I've seen, you know, preaching and teaching and experienced that's kind of divorced from life, that oh, I'm preaching this because I read it out of a book, or I'm teaching this because somebody else said it. And to me, there's not any real energy in that. Sure. I mean, you can be an excitable person and kind of gin up some enthusiasm, but you haven't experienced it for yourself.
That's right.
And so, yeah, there kind of came a point for me where I started saying, you know, if I'm going to say these things, I really need to have some experience with it.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
And it makes us genuine teachers. You know what I mean? Not because we're trying hard to be genuine. No, it genuinely happens in our life, in our role as teachers, where we do care. And speaking of leaning in, we lean in to the stories and we lean into listening. Something that I know for a fact that I could not generate on my own because of my selfish nature, but this type of practice has really immersed in my life, that I feel an authentic love for people and love for teaching, you know, for people to find this in their lives.
Yeah. I always think that, well, like you said, that, you know, I think back when you were maybe took one of the classes, I said something like, you can tell when somebody is speaking out of a deep well.
Yes.
And at that time, I probably would have said, well, maybe there are 4 or 5 people I know who are doing that, who I want to really hear teach, because I know that when they speak, it's coming out of this deep well within them. They're not talking about something theoretical or something out there. They're speaking, and I would probably say there are more than 4 or 5 now who I know. But you can tell as a listener, if you have your spiritual antenna up, you know when somebody's just trying to con you or tell you something that they haven't experienced.
That's correct.
You can tell the difference.
That's right. That's right.
And so, you know, there's something, you know, the scripture that says deep calls to deep. I think Psalm 42. You recognize when somebody else is coming from their depths.
That's
something in your depth recognizes that.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, absolutely. I use David as an example in the Psalms, now that you mentioned, when he says God's love is everlasting, or when he's overwhelmed with God's, you know, protection, it's like there's no way that he could have just theoretically thought about that and then wrote it down. He had to have been experiencing it to proclaim in such a fervor, you know, way in his words. And so I think this type of spirituality provides that for us. To end our conversation, I want to make sure that this is the invitation here, and I know you're going to have a great perspective about this. You know, the doctrines that we learn, and in this case, we're in a Methodist church, so we have a Wesleyan doctrine, right? But if we were in a Baptist, which is part of your roots, Jerry, there's a Baptist doctrine. So there are all these doctrines, and one of our favorite teachers and authors, Richard Rohr, says that those are launching pads, right? And so, but God, you know, within the basics of our doctrines, but there's this launching pad for us to continue to explore this beautiful holy mystery, right?
Right.
Isn't this what contemplative spirituality does for us? What do you think about that?
Yeah, that's a great image, a launching pad. So not a single one of our traditions holds all the truth. So I always, you know, while I may have a launching pad, I continually have to explore out here and out there, which is really how I started 27 years ago in the 1990s, you know, as a Baptist pastor. And I started exploring other ways of prayer as part of what got me in trouble
with good Baptist people, you know, the
Yeah.
people in my congregation as, oh,
Sure.
you're reading too many Catholics now. You're reading Quakers, you're reading Methodists, you know,
Yeah.
and, but it was a part of that restlessness that we talked about a while ago that I started exploring outside, you know, and so, yeah, I think to explore, to be able to, but I mean, Eugene Peterson in one of his books says, you know, one of the first things that we have, temptations that we have to fight is when we start exploring, we look at our neighbor's backyard, you know, like the Catholics or the Orthodox or the Quakers, and say, oh, I want to live in that backyard. I want to go there. And Peterson says, the invitation is not always to leave your own home.
That's right.
You know, you can explore where other people are without, you know, like in your case and in your setting at MD UMC, you can explore these things without saying, well, I'm going to give up the Methodist Church.
That's correct. That's correct.
Yeah.
If anything, what I've learned is it endears the tradition more,
Yeah.
because as you're exploring, it deepens your own tradition.
Right.
In many ways. So,
Yeah.
so that's the beauty behind of this freedom that God is inviting us to explore.
In fact, I think that's what Peterson ends up saying in that little quote that I've forgotten until you just said. He said, no, you don't need to go to somebody else's backyard. You need to drill deeply in your own backyard. And exactly what you just said. So
that's right. Yeah.
So yeah, you know, most of us can find these things in the traditions in which we live.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
So,
well, Jerry, what an incredible conversation. I mean,
this is great.
All day long. We want to thank all of you for joining us. If you have any comments or any questions for Jerry or myself, please leave them in the comment area, or you can email me. You'll have that information in our introduction. But yeah, please reach out. We definitely want to hear from you. We want to hear your reflections from this conversation. And Jerry, I don't want to just do this once a year anymore. So I'm going to make sure that I come up with more material for you to reflect on. I thank you so much for your wisdom and, of course, your friendship all these years. And I think we're gonna invite a lot of people to reflect with these conversations during this series.
This is great. I've enjoyed it a lot and look forward to the next few conversations. Yeah. Excellent.
Well, we'll see all of you next week again, same time, same day. And those of you that cannot watch it when it comes out in our social media channels, just know that it'll be on our YouTube channel and it'll be on our Facebook page this whole time. So you're able to go in and watch it at your own leisure. So we thank you so much for your time. And Jerry, I will see you soon.
All right. Good deal, Victor. Thank you all for watching. See you.
We are so glad you joined us for this week's conversation. Please send us any comments or questions in the comment area below. I want to remind you that a sermon message is and should be part of our spiritual formation, and not just more information we learn about God. In the words of Jerry Weber, spirituality refers to a person's deepening connection with God that makes a difference in their relationship with God, self, others, and the created world. Shalom, beloved.